Just let Are we good? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you very loud and clear.
Hi, so good morning, everyone. Thank you, Amar. Thank you for inviting me. It is my privilege to speak to you this morning. So just as a quick background on the Asia Foundation, while most of you may be familiar with the Asia Foundation, we are a nonprofit international development organization committed to improving lives and expanding opportunities across Asia and the Pacific. So we are informed by our decades of experience and deep local expertise across the entire region. While our headquarters is in San Francisco, the Asia Foundation actually has a network of 18 country offices all over Asia and the Pacific. And I come from one of those country offices. I come from the Philippines. The Philippines is in Southeast Asia, for those who may not be very familiar. In the Philippines, actually, the Asia Foundation has a long-standing presence and commitment in the Philippines. We have been operating in the Philippines since 1954. And our work spans from working with government, civil society, the private sector, in strengthening democratic institutions, supporting economic growth, strengthening the rule of law, improving education, and fostering peace and development in Mindanao. And that is where I draw the latter part of that. Our work in supporting peace and development in the southern Philippines, in Mindanao, is where I would be drawing some of the points that I would be sharing with you this morning. So, in southern Mindanao, in southern Philippines, after decades of conflict, finally, a successful peace agreement was signed in 2014 between the Philippine government and the Bangsamoro. And thus started the transition to a new governance arrangement, which is the creation of the new region with greater autonomy from the central government. It has its own parliament, it has its own regional bureaucracy. And this is a result of a very long negotiated political settlement, as well as, of course, conflict and violence happening. So since that signing, it is very positive that the implementation of the peace agreement has been moving forward since 2014, especially in the political side of things, meaning the creation of the new regional government. When it comes into the security side of things, what we have noticed is vertical violence, which is the violence between the state and the non-state, has been declining. And that is very positive. However, parallel to that, we have seen a trend where horizontal violence, which is local violence, local conflict happening at the community level, between communities, among communities, for different reasons, different vulnerabilities that trigger violent conflict, seem to be on the rise. And so armed conflict, though not between the military and the non-state anymore, but armed conflict still continues to burden the everyday lives of local communities. Especially these communities have already gone through decades of conflict, have lived through decades of conflict. Unfortunately, they continue to face local everyday contestations, intercommunal violence, clan conflicts, and the continued presence of violent extremist groups. And this is where we felt we could support communities best, in supporting and working with local actors in addressing vulnerabilities to such local violent conflicts. This is because, we believed that it is the communities, right? It is the local actors who understand the situation best, and who hold the answers to the problems that are causing violent conflict, right? So over the past 4 years, we have worked very closely with local actors, and we have seen, number one, that local vulnerabilities and issues that lead to violent conflict are more effectively addressed by local actors. And number two, that the challenges posed by violent conflict are best addressed with a positive peace-building approach, with an approach that emphasizes building community cohesion, social cohesion, and resilience to violent conflict. So therefore, it's also about moving away from the usual overly securitized approach to addressing violence, to one that embraces a community-centered approach, driven by a nuanced understanding of felt needs, grievances, and strengths of the community. And so now I move towards social cohesion, right, as a concept, because I just said that that is the main approach that you want to take in addressing local violence. And we all know, we all live this every day, that social cohesion is a relational concept. It meaning it's about relationships between and among people, between and among communities, within communities. It explains how individuals and groups coexist. It is also determined by the level of cohesion in the community could be determined by structures. What are the current structures in our communities? What are the attitudes? What are the behaviors that shape the interactions in our communities? Similarly, it also helps us understand how society and institutions relate to each other, and how dynamics within a society lead to conflict. But I also just want to emphasize that having social cohesion does not imply a total absence of tension and conflict, right? That's part of our everyday community life. But what we're saying is social cohesion helps us go beyond, helps us transcend conflicts and tensions. It helps us address conflict and tensions without having to resort to violence, right? And that's where let's unpack, if I may, if that's okay. Let's unpack what cohesion actually means, right? And what are the different elements that help us build cohesion in our communities. So in our work in the Asia Foundation in the Philippines, we saw that there are several elements to building cohesion, and there are several tensions around that. If we look at our communities, I'm sure we could reflect back, right, and see, okay, so how do this address, how do this explain how we relate to each other? Number one is, the first two are institutional. We look at the institutions that are present in our communities. And first there is inclusion versus exclusion. Who is included? Who is excluded? And if we put this in the context of institutions, for example, access to labor market, access to economic opportunities, right? Access to capital, access to education. Who is included here and who is excluded, right? Inclusion versus exclusion. That's number one. Number two is legitimacy versus illegitimacy, right? And that's with our institutions. Do community members feel that they are represented by, and do they trust institutions, right? So that is where the legitimacy of institutions, meaning not just formal institutions, but could also be informal institutions, right? Like Council of Elders could be considered as an informal institution. And so their legitimacy or illegitimacy comes from whether members of the community see that they are being represented there, whether they trust the members of these institutions. The next part is more, I would say, foundational, meaning how do we view the foundations of our community life? First, we have participation versus non-involvement, right? So who is participating? Who is not participating? Why are they not participating? In our experience, directly talking to the communities, it is very important that number one, we meet them where they are. The other group that we are trying to reach, right? We meet them where they are. We are the ones who go and view things from their perspective. We don't expect them to meet us where we want them to be. And that's very strong. And it's also important that we understand what are the barriers to participation. What are the barriers to involvement? It could be multi-pronged. It could be historical. It could be a feeling of mistrust, distrust. It could also be a feeling of not of inferiority, right? It could be many things. And so it's important that we understand where they are coming from, and we meet them there. And the next is belonging versus isolation, right? Or recognition versus rejection. This speaks of shared values, but also how tolerant are we in our community for differences, towards differences, right? Our communities cannot be homogeneous. I mean, there's always differences there. And that's part of community life, right? What we want to see is the level of tolerance to diversity that is present in our communities, whether community members still feel that they belong in our community despite, or perhaps ideally, even because of the diversity that is present in our communities. And the fifth one, and this is something that we saw is very important if we want to move towards working together, right? It's agency versus beneficiary. So let's tackle the first one. Beneficiary means, that we are seeing some members of our population just as, just standing there, just waiting, right? Just as beneficiaries, just as receiving, right? But in our experience, recognizing the agency, meaning recognizing that they themselves are the agents. Remember when I started, I said that local actors have the solutions. They have the answers, right? So that makes all the difference as we work towards building cohesion and resilience in our partner communities, in supporting them in looking for that, right? And it has not always been easy. We have had to learn and adapt and change along the way. When we were starting out, it hasn't always been successful. It really called on us to be open and to learn as well, to take on like a learning position, that we're not here with the solutions, we're actually here to learn from them, right? On how they understand the problems and what solutions they think would best address the problems. And when we saw how communities work together, there are certain factors that we saw facilitated success, and I'm sure these could resonate in your communities. Number one is the commitment of local leaders is very important. We can maybe call them like the peace holders, right? There are those persons in our communities who could hold that, who could hold peace. They may or may not be officials, right? They may or may not be from government, but they are the ones that people go to. and their commitment and leadership is important. Second is there has to be the openness and willingness to recognize that there are vulnerabilities, that we are having problems in our community. We have to start there, right? If we start from a position of denial of that there are problems in our community, that our community is experiencing vulnerabilities to violence and conflict, then it would be more difficult for us to move towards problem solving, right? So we start with an openness and willingness to recognize vulnerabilities. Third is, alongside the peace holders, there are also influencer groups, movers or change makers at the community, right? And they keep the gears turning. They are the ones who make sure that things are moving forward. We also have to look for these change makers in our community. Fourth is, and to me, this is very important, this is the most crucial, is putting the collective voice of the community at the center. And what does that mean? It means, number one, it starts from the definition of the issues, the vulnerabilities that the communities are facing, the challenges that our communities are facing have to be defined collectively by the community, not from anyone outside of the community. And that moves towards talking through solutions, identifying what's the best solution for them, implementing the solution themselves, and lastly, being there as well for the monitoring, for the accountability part. And this is where our most successful communities really thrive. If they were at the center of all of those steps, defining the problem, designing the solution, implementing the solution, and monitoring the initiative. And so I may be already over time. Just what few more points for me. And I just want to end with sharing with you what we have learned about social cohesion, if that's okay. We've learned that why should we strive, right, for more cohesive communities? It's because, as I said earlier, having cohesion does not mean the absence of violence, the absence of conflict and tension, right? But more cohesive communities are better able to respond to conflict and prevent violence. And if conflict does escalate to violence, more cohesive communities are better able to stop the violence and move past it, right? And start a collective healing process. We also saw that locally led and locally owned efforts towards building inclusion and resilience lead to positive outcomes. Local ownership, like co-ownership of the entire process, is really key. And third is deliberate and targeted approaches are necessary so that we reach population segments that would otherwise not participate in community activities. Unfortunately, it is not in the Philippines. It is common that if there's going to be like a dialogue within the community, then the community leaders just send out an announcement, and the expectation is people will come. Sure, people will come. But those who will come are already those who are interested in the first place, right? They are already those who are involved in community life in the first place. What we want when we're working towards community cohesion is to reach those who are not interested, right? To reach those who would not normally be participating in our community activities. And that's when very deliberate, very targeted approaches are important. And this is where, as I said earlier, we have to meet them where they are. If they are not comfortable going to community centers, we go where they are most comfortable. We talk to them first. We ask them, what kind of activity at the community, would be useful for you, would be interesting for you, right? How can we make this like more attractive to them, right? For them to join. And another thing is we also saw that institutions, more effective and accountable institutions actually bolster social cohesion. And that's the reason why a core part of our work is we work with subnational governments. We work with local government units in helping improve, efficiency and accountability in these institutions, and in helping them actually take the lead, in building cohesion and resilience. Because in the Philippines, it is the local governments, as we call them, or the subnational governments, that are the institutions closest to the people, right? They have the resources. Their proximity to the people should give them access to information, access to a nuanced understanding of the situation being faced by the communities, right? And, they have the structure, they have the reach, they have the money, they have the projects. And so it is very important that, more effective and accountable institutions actually bolster cohesion at the community level. And lastly, and I think this is why your activity today is very important, shared learning among communities is necessary in supporting capacities for building social cohesion. We helped facilitate, we helped, get platforms for shared learning. We brought some members of our communities a totally different province, right? And experiences were shared there. They talked directly with community members. They talked directly with, those who were leading the change makers that I was talking about earlier. And in those exchanges, we saw that there's, number one, a broader perspective that they take home with them. Like, that's okay, maybe that's possible, maybe that's also something that we can do in our community. And also, second, it's also a broadening view and tolerance, and actually embracing diversity, right? Because we bring them to different communities of different ethnic groups, of very different cultures. And so they become exposed, and that exposure, that broadening perspective, they bring it back with them when they go back to their communities. So this learning session is very important, and I encourage that we continue with these learning sessions. Sometimes, there's even that friendly competition, among our community partners, right? Because when they get back together again, they are very eager to share that, this is what happened now. These are the positive developments that are happening in this community. And so that really, builds that fire in them. And it also creates a support group amongst our partners, right? So if they are having some concerns in their community, and then they recall, oh, yeah, this other community faced this problem like 2 years ago, maybe I can ask them how they did it. So that network, that community of practice has to be kept alive. And what we're trying to do now is to introduce what we call accountability circles, meaning members of of a community are paired, like, we keep it small, like a group of 3 to 5 from different communities, right? And they do their pledges there. Like, they say, this is what we're gonna do, this is what we're going to try to do in our community, right? And then they're called accountability circles, because then they ask each other, like, okay, did you follow through? Like, did you do this? How did you do this, right? And it's a more candid, way. We don't even have to be part of the conversation, right? So it doesn't seem like a monitoring and an evaluation activity, right? But it's really just building that community of practice among our partners. So yes, that's it for for this morning, and I hope that's useful for your activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Very, very useful. Actually, I know you have a busy day and must be about 1 o'clock in the afternoon there, or 12, right? But it was quite insightful. But can I ask just a couple of questions? Yes.
Of course,
Yeah.
yes.
Am I right by saying that the government of Philippines entered into some kind of a agreement or peace
Yes.
agreement somewhere around 2014? Is it 2000?
Yes, that's correct.
2000? So even after 2014, there were incidents of violence.
Yeah.
what I would call cycles of violence that bring back memories and, get back to the old memories come back. And
Definitely.
your work involved in going to the communities and working with communities. But here in Sri Lanka, we have slightly different kind of a situation where sometimes there are political actors nationally that say things that instigate some kind of violence, and these
Right.
political actors are something that sometimes CSOs find difficult to kind of maneuver or to manage. Like for instance, uh, couple of days ago, I don't know, people here may remember, one of the politicians said at a public meeting that he's ready to go to the northern part of Jaffna and, break their necks and bring their heads back to Colombo. And nothing was done. And I don't see anything in CSO circles or anybody talking about it. Okay, so a couple of us may tweet. Now, how do we deal with something like that? You can go to the communities and build social cohesion, but when political actors kind of intervene and say things and do things, maybe right in the parliament, how do you deal with that? That is one question. Whether you have any kind of experience in that, or maybe in other uh,
Mm.
Asia
Mm.
Foundation, partners in other countries, whether they have anything. And the second point is maybe another question some of our CSO partners may have. You see, we organize uh, pocket meetings, we organize, dialogues, but the key people that you and I were talking about even a couple of days ago, the change agents, the influencers, the,
Yeah.
people whom I call the yeast in the dough that can make the bread rise, the yeast in the communities. They do not kind of get connected to civil society or to the NGOs, or they
Mm.
are, they are a bit removed socially. Uh, they don't want to come for meetings or whatever. And sometimes it's difficult to get them involved. They have influence. And like you said, sometimes it's like preaching to the choir to the converted. And it's the
Yeah.
same people who come for these meetings and they're already converted. Uh,
Yeah.
so how do we build a trust and build that
Mm.
relationship? And you said that we have to go to them. So maybe sometimes go and meet them one to one and, try to get their opinion because it's a collective effort. So any thoughts on these two questions,
Sure.
Kathleen?
Thank you. Um, Not easy questions, but let's go to the first one, right? And I totally understand where you're coming from, and that's where we are as well in many different respects, especially before the signing of the peace agreement, right? When national politicians could say something that would inflame, right? That could lead to that could spark actual, violence in our communities. And what we saw was one thing that helped move the peace process forward in the Philippines is the robust presence of civil society. It's really the peace organizations, the peace building organizations, especially in Mindanao, were the ones who did not let go of the entire process. Even when, and they're the ones who put social pressure when the formal negotiating table seems to be rocky, right? Or one party may want to be pulling out. It's the civil society who would go to them and, talk to them and exert social pressure for the two parties to sit back down together. And that was really key. And they were also the ones involved in monitoring ceasefires. Not easy work, dangerous work, definitely, like putting yourself in the middle, right? But that was something that really, I would say, was key to seeing that peace agreement signed in 2014. So that's number one, civil society. Number two, what I can also say perhaps is, if the community level cohesion is strong, then there's um bigger chances for us to be able to correct statements from, say, the higher level, right, from politicians, because number one, communication lines have been opened, right? Communication lines are there, so when something is being said, then it would be easier to speak to each other. It would be easier to um just collectively say we don't agree. um and so cohesion still is important there. Communication lines still is very, very important there, as I would say, as a call out force, right? Just to say that, we don't agree, or we also see that it's very quick here in the Philippines for civil society organizations to issue statements condemning what this politician said, or saying that we don't support it and this is what we want to do. And that really helps move the peace process forward. It's not without any of its challenges. It has been, it has been stymied. It has been, there has been pockets of really of all out war even. But then, it's that external pressure from civil society that is one of the key factors that brought the two parties back to the table. Of late, we have, as a country, also faced that, not towards conflict, but more around human rights, which is another thing that our country is now trying to move past, move forward from, right? Same from the previous president, same roughly the same sentiment around, if for drug addicts, kill them, and I got your back, like, coming from, but then again, we have human rights organizations, we have civil society who are actively speaking out and actively working to still, put forward the human rights agenda in the Philippines. Yeah. On the second question around how do we reach those who are not interested, right?
Who are influential but yet do not want to
Yeah,
get involved in
right.
NGO, civil society discussion
Right.
on.
Well, number one, we have to understand where they're coming from. We have to understand them, right? We have to understand their political economy. Like, what are their interests? And how do we make this interesting for them, right? It's about understanding what makes them tick, right? And what are their incentives that would make sense for them to be involved in this. Say, for example, you have your local politician who's been hypothetically, like, locally entrenched, right? They have been in power for a long time, and so why do they have to worry all of a sudden about cohesion, right? They will be in power anyway. They will continue to be in power anyway, right? But if we try to frame, if we make it interesting for them, if there are incentives enough for them to join, meaning this would perhaps help strengthen your understanding of your communities, this would help strengthen your relationship with your community, things that would make them more interested, that could be the starting point. So there's a good, there's
There's no good
just
answer, correct, wholesome answer to this, but something that we have
yeah,
to look at it creatively and come up with a
yes,
Yes.
There's actually a very creative way that, communications group use. Like when you create a profile of the person that you're trying to engage, right? Just try to understand it. Imagine the day of this person, from the time this person wakes up, what does he do? What do they do? Who do they talk to, right? And then what's their favorite book? Just trying to humanize them, just trying to see them as humans, and understanding what makes them tick. And that could be, an entry point. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take several conversations. One-on-one conversations could be another approach as well. Another creative approach as well could be to look at who do they listen to.
They may listen to their wives. So I think we can have.
Then talk to their wives, right?
I think the role of the woman is also very important in this, and I mean,
Definitely.
we could have a separate conversation on that.
Yes.
What was the role of the women especially in Philippines, and the role of the church, Catholic Church?
Yeah. Yes. The role of our religious leaders is important. They also have political power, so to speak, or political persuasion, right? The role of women is also very important. So just understanding who do they listen to, and then maybe those are the entry points that you could explore.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kathleen. I have several, we could go on and on, we could have a separate seminar on this, but I think time is a constraint. So I will stop at that. Thank you very much for your time. I think we will continue if it's possible for us, for Marga to have these frequent discussions, maybe with another group of people, maybe sometime in a month's time, when you're also free.
So, just let me know.
I'll
make myself available for Marga. Thank you.
You can continue to be connected. You have asked to relieve yourself. I think you have work to do, but
Thank you.
You can stay as long as like. So I'm going to stop the recording here.
Okay.
And we will break for tea now. They'll bring the tea. I will give a summary in Sinhala, maybe to the participants here.